It wasn't the kind of place where people locked their doors until the Whitlocks moved in. I'm Daniel Harrow, and this is a macabre record. If you travel 40 miles southeast of Spokane, through pine-dense highways and forgotten service roads, you'll find yourself in the sleepy town of Gerritton, Washington. Population just under 3,000, a place of porch swings and Sunday bake sales, where high school football is religion and the grocery clerk knows your dog's name. The kind of town where change comes slow, and outsiders even slower. But in 1996, a family of 5 moved into the crumbling Whitlock estate just beyond Route 9. The house had been empty for 2 decades. Locals whispered it was cursed. It sat on an old lumber mill, twisted in rust and blackberry bramble. A few kids had dared each other to break in over the years. Most came running out by dusk, pale and shaking, talking about shadows that didn't move right. Then the Whitlocks arrived. Tall, polite, old world, as one neighbor put it, dressed like Victorian portraits, always smiling. At first, they were just an eccentric curiosity, a flicker of strange color in the town's sepia-tone predictability. But over the next 7 years, Gerritton would become the site of one of the darkest, most ritualistic abuse cases in the Pacific Northwest. A case so bizarre and so meticulously concealed that even now, almost 2 decades later, it feels more myth than memory. The Whitlock family case would go on to break national headlines. It would shatter lives, and it would raise one question that still echoes in Gerritton to this day. How many signs did we miss, and why? From the outside, the Whitlocks were private, proper, practically quaint. But inside their manor, something else was taking shape. Over the next 11 parts, we'll unravel a story of psychological control, esoteric beliefs, and a darkness so tightly woven into daily life it wore the mask of tradition. This is not just a story about what they did, it's a story about what we ignored. They looked like something from a painting, and they acted like it too, always composed, always smiling, but off, like they were playing a part. And Debbie Flanagan, former neighbor, interview transcript 2007. When the Whitlock family moved into the old estate in the fall of 1996, they didn't just take up residence in a house, they performed it. Let me paint a picture. The father, Reginald Whitlock, was 53. Silver hair combed back with precision, a voice like sanded oak. He wore 3-piece suits to the post office. Claimed to be a retired professor of religious studies, though no institution ever confirmed it. His hands never shook, his tone never rose. People described him as measured, refined, quietly persuasive. His wife, Margaret Whitlock, was younger, 39, willowy, pale, dresses that brushed the floor and lace gloves even in summer. She rarely spoke in public, but when she did, it was always with formality. She'd curtsy to thank the cashier at the co-op. Every word she said seemed rehearsed, like she was quoting scripture no one else had read. Then there were the children, 3, all homeschooled. Lawrence, the eldest, was 17 when they arrived. Broad-shouldered with a stare too still for someone that young. Townsfolk called him the Sentinel because he was always standing, watching, almost never blinked. Clara, the middle child, was 12, known for her eerie poise and tendency to hum old hymns under her breath at the farmer's market. Never looked anyone in the eye, never spoke unless spoken to. And then the youngest, Elias, barely 6 at the time, frail, shy, carried a leather-bound book with him everywhere, even to the town's annual Founders Parade. No one ever saw what was inside. We thought they were just old-fashioned. That's what people told themselves. Gerritton didn't know what to do with people like the Whitlocks, so it wrapped them in words like eccentric and private, and left it at that. When Reginald offered free Latin lessons at the library, no one questioned it. When Margaret refused to attend town meetings because of impurity of energy, people smiled and nodded, assuming it was some New Age thing. But it wasn't New Age. It wasn't old-fashioned. It was something else entirely. From the outside, the Whitlocks were almost admirable. They hosted a harvest festival each October. They donated to the church. They kept their lawn trimmed and their windows shut. but the windows were always shut, and inside, no one knew what was happening. The estate itself became a kind of myth. Children whispered about bonfires in the woods behind it, strange chanting in the early hours, lights flickering when no one was around. But Gerriton had always loved its ghost stories, and the Whitlocks, they fit too neatly into the town's strange folklore to be seen as a real threat. We thought they were weird, but harmless. They waved, they baked, they volunteered. And Sheriff Hal Porter retired. But sometimes masks don't slip, sometimes they are designed never to. And it would take more than odd behavior for Gerriton to question the family it had so carefully tucked into the fabric of its quiet life. It wasn't one big thing. It was 1,000 little things that didn't add up. You feel them before you see them, and by the time you do, it's too late. In June Medley, retired librarian, Gerriton Public Library. If you ask the townspeople now, the ones who were there, they'll tell you they knew something was wrong. But at the time, it was easier not to look too closely. Let's start with the library incident. In 1998, 2 years after the Whitlocks moved in, Lawrence, the eldest son, was volunteering twice a week at the Gerriton Public Library. He was courteous, quiet, reshelved books with obsessive precision. But one day, a patron, a woman named Renee Caldwell, spotted something odd. Lawrence was in the children's section, not shelving, just standing, staring down at a girl maybe 9 or 10 years old, not saying a word, not moving, just watching her read. Renee approached. She said his face was utterly blank. When she asked him if everything was all right, he turned to her and said, and I quote, "She has too much light in her. My father says that can be corrected." The girl burst into tears. The librarian, June Medley, wrote it off as teen awkwardness, but she remembered the words. She still has the journal she used to record strange occurrences back then. That quote is written in red ink. She has too much light in her. There were the missing pets, too. Starting in late '99, cats and small dogs began vanishing in a 4-block radius around the Whitlock estate. No blood, no collars, just gone. At first, folks thought it was coyotes. A flyer went up at the feed store, but then someone found a circle of black feathers and burned wax behind the Miller family's shed. No one reported it, just tossed it aside like old trash. A few teenagers smoking near the trail behind the Whitlocks' property said they once heard moaning coming from the woods after midnight. Not animal, human, but again this was Gerriton. It was easier to chalk it up to dares, drunken games, or overactive imaginations than confront the alternative. Then there was Elias, the youngest. Teachers at the local co-op noticed he flinched at sudden noises, rarely made eye contact, always wore long sleeves, even in June. At a parent-child picnic in the spring of 2000, Elias was overheard whispering a phrase over and over again into the grass. "The fire eats the badness, the fire eats the badness." When asked what it meant, he blinked slowly and said, "That's what Mother says before the cellar." Again, no report was filed. Because Margaret Whitlock showed up moments later, offered tea and lemon cakes, and reminded the teachers how grateful they were for the school's effort to accommodate sensitive children. They smiled, they nodded, they forgot. We must understand the psychology of denial. People prefer the world to make sense. To believe a family can be too strange to trust is also to admit something darker. That evil can smile at you from across a bake sale table. That's what the Whitlocks were counting on. And so the town did what most small towns do when discomfort scratches at the surface. They looked away. They stopped coming into town after a while. It was like they didn't need us anymore, or like we were spoiling something they were trying to keep clean. Pastor Ron Kimbrough, First Congregational Church of Gerriton. By the early 2000s, the Whitlocks had begun to recede from town life. They stopped attending community events. No more harvest festivals. No more Sunday appearances at church. Reginald declined invitations to town council meetings, citing spiritual cleansing and a distrust of worldly institutions. The family had become a myth inside its own home, and yet people still saw things. It began with Clara. In 2001, she would have been about 17. Locals remember her walking barefoot along the outskirts of town at dawn. always alone, always silent. One man, Jeremy Tavers, a retired logger, was driving back from a night shift when he nearly hit her just outside the southern tree line. She was standing in the middle of the road, wearing a thin cotton gown, arms extended slightly, palms up. He told her to get in. She didn't answer, just looked at him and whispered, "I've been made clean. Have you?" Then she turned and walked into the woods. He called the sheriff's office. A deputy drove by later that day, but saw nothing. No report was filed. Jeremy never brought it up again. The Whitlock children, once seen now and then around town, disappeared from public view. Neighbors reported drawn curtains day and night. The windows were always closed. On the rare occasion one of the children did come outside, usually Clara or Elias, they would stop moving entirely if someone approached, as if contact was forbidden. They looked hollow. I don't know how else to say it. Like the body was there, but the person had gone. Angela Torres, former mail carrier, Elias especially, seemed to shrink further into himself. Angela remembers leaving a package on the Whitlock porch one afternoon, a rare occurrence, since most mail was collected from the P.O. box downtown. As she walked away, she turned back and saw Elias watching her from the side window, his hand pressed against the glass. She lifted her hand to wave. He didn't wave back, but he mouthed something. She couldn't hear the words, but she read his lips clearly. "Please don't forget me." She said. She froze, stared at him for a moment, then turned and walked quickly back to her truck. She never reported it. She still regrets that. There's something important we need to understand about isolation as a tool. In cultic systems, the removal of external influence is not just a byproduct, it's a strategy. Without contrast, abuse becomes truth. Pain becomes cleansing. The absence of other voices creates one sacred narrative. Reginald and Margaret Whitlock didn't just isolate their children from the town, they were replacing the world with something else. And Gerriton, whether out of politeness, fear, or the comfort of ignorance, allowed it for a while, until something slipped. I don't know what made me look. Maybe the way he was limping, or maybe just a feeling. But I remember thinking, this boy shouldn't be walking alone in the dark. The Vivian Knox, night shift nurse, Gerriton Regional Hospital. It was February 13th, 2003, a Thursday night, cold and sleeting. Most of Gerriton was asleep by 10 p.m., and even the roads into town were empty. But just before midnight, a young boy, barefoot, soaked and shaking, walked into the ER at Gerriton Regional Hospital. He didn't say his name. He didn't say anything. The nurse on duty, Vivian Knox, initially mistook him for a runaway. Dirt-streaked face, ragged flannel shirt, several sizes too big. His left foot was bleeding, glass shards embedded in the heel. His skin was ghostly pale. When she asked him what happened, he looked at her, really looked, for the first time, and whispered, "He made us drink the dark." Vivian said a chill went down her spine. She asked who he was. The boy just repeated it. "He made us drink the dark." Then he passed out. The hospital called the sheriff's office. Deputy Carl Winslow responded. His report, now public record, listed the boy as approximately 10-11 years old, 4'5", 72 pounds, malnourished, exhibiting signs of chronic neglect and possible ritual abuse. What stood out immediately was the boy's back. Dozens of thin, healed scars in symmetrical patterns, crosses, circles, a 5-pointed star etched just below his right shoulder blade. He had no identification. But within 30 minutes of his arrival, the Whitlocks did. Reginald and Margaret showed up together at 12:46 a.m. According to hospital security logs, they were calm. Margaret brought a small velvet pouch. Inside were herbal tinctures and a folded slip of parchment with symbols drawn in blood, later tested and confirmed as animal origin. Reginald identified the boy as their youngest son, Elias, said he had suffered a spiritual break and that they were there to retrieve him. He provided a notarized document stating the boy was under their care and subject to familial theological jurisdiction, a phrase that at the time had no legal precedent in Washington state. The attending physician, Dr. Helen Curtis, refused to release the boy. Reginald didn't argue. He simply smiled and said, "The house will call him back. The flesh is weak, but the tether is strong." Then they left, without another word. The hospital filed a formal concern with Child Protective Services the next morning. The caseworker, Angela Dorset, arrived 2 days later, but by then, Elias was gone. According to the night nurse on duty, Elias awoke briefly that evening. He was confused. He asked where the fire room was. He said he wasn't supposed to talk to sky-colored people. Then, sometime between 3:10 and 3:45 a.m., he vanished. Security footage from the hallway showed nothing. No one entered, no alarms tripped. His IV line was left intact on the floor, blood still fresh. His window was locked from the inside. To this day, Elias Whitlock's disappearance remains unsolved. The official record says, voluntary runaway, no sign of abduction. But Dr. Curtis still insists that child didn't leave, he was taken or called. The town could no longer pretend the Whitlocks were just peculiar. Someone finally decided to dig. It wasn't that no one believed me, it's that they believed me and still told me to back off. Angela Dorset, former CPS investigator. By mid-February 2003, whispers had become questions. Elias Whitlock was gone. The hospital had filed formal concern. A child had walked barefoot through winter rain, bleeding and muttering about drinking the dark. And yet, nothing happened. No search warrant, no formal inquiry, no escalation. Why? Because systems built to protect often fail not from malice, but from friction, from fear, from bureaucracy, from the slow grind of red tape smothering urgency. Angela Dorset, the CPS caseworker assigned to the Whitlocks, submitted her initial risk assessment on February 16, 2003. It flagged educational neglect, no formal records of homeschooling, religious coercion, children quoting ritualistic phrases during interviews, probable psychological abuse. But Angela's superior, Judith Kellerman, marked the case non-emergent. Her notes read, family exhibits unusual but non-criminal belief system, no documented physical abuse. Angela pushed back. She requested an emergency home visit and psychological assessments of all 3 children. Judith denied the request. Her reasoning? The Whitlocks are protected under religious exemption clauses. Pursuing this without cause could trigger litigation. Religious exemption, that's the term that kept reappearing. The Whitlocks were associated with an obscure registered organization called the Order of the Flame Beneath, established in 1991 as a neo-monastic spiritual practice focused on purification and sacred obedience. It wasn't technically a cult, at least not on paper. According to state documents, it was a legally protected religious group. They paid property taxes, filed clean paperwork, and most importantly, had never been charged with a crime. Angela tried again. She contacted the school board, but because the Whitlocks were listed as private religious homeschoolers, there was no requirement to submit curriculum or testing. She tried the sheriff's office. Deputy Winslow agreed the case felt off, but noted that without probable cause, there's no grounds to enter the property. She even contacted the county DA. No one moved, not because they thought Angela was wrong, but because they were afraid she was right. Because if the Whitlocks were abusing their children, then someone had failed, multiple someones, over years, and no one in power wanted to wear that weight. Even the townspeople seemed divided. Some still defended the family. So they keep to themselves. So what? They're not hurting anyone, they don't blast music, they don't drink. Leave them be. Harold Renshaw, hardware store owner. But others began to speak, quietly, carefully. The local pastor admitted Margaret had once handed him a sealed envelope labeled Confessions of the Flesh. She said it contained prayers from Clara. When he opened it weeks later, he found pages of drawings, twisted symbols, blacked-out eyes, figures bound in fire. He didn't report it. He burned it and pretended it never existed. Angela Dorset refused to let it go. She drove past the Whitlock estate every night after work, just watching. On the night of March 3rd, she saw something she couldn't explain. In the woods behind the house, a flicker of blue fire. Then a figure, Clara maybe, standing alone, arms lifted, hair unbound, face turned skyward. Angela pulled over, reached for her camera. But when she raised it, the light vanished. So she drove home. And that night, someone broke into her garage, left no fingerprints, took nothing except her camera. She filed a police report. No follow-up was ever conducted. This was the moment the story could have ended, where silence might have cemented itself again. But something, or someone, was about to change the tide. Because even when institutions fail, some people don't let go. There was something off about that family. And it wasn't just superstition. It was structure, ritual, doctrine. They weren't improvising. They were following a script. Martin Greaves, investigative journalist. North Sound Weekly, enter Martin Greaves. A freelance investigative reporter with a background in cult deprogramming cases, Greaves had made his name writing exposés on fringe religious sects operating under legal cover. By the time he stumbled across the Whitlocks, he'd already tangled with groups from Montana to Maine. But Garreton got under his skin. Greaves was visiting Spokane in March 2003 when a former source tipped him off to a strange case out in a rural town, something about a missing boy, conflicting reports, and a family of ghosts who spoke in verses, the Whitlocks. Within a week, Greaves had rented a room above the bakery in Garreton and started digging. What he found was a puzzle with pieces deliberately shaved down to not fit together. First, he filed a FOIA request for Reginald Whitlock's academic background. The results came back empty. No record of a doctorate, no university employment, not even a completed bachelor's degree. Yet Reginald had claimed to be a professor of religious anthropology. He spoke at a Spokane Rotary Club event in '98 as Dr. Whitlock. Video evidence exists. He presented slides of pre-Christian purification rites allegedly practiced by Eastern European monastics. The language was erudite, the tone convincing, but the sources he cited were fabricated. The texts didn't exist. The scholars he referenced were not in any database. One name, Dr. Aurelian Morsk, appeared in multiple places, yet no such person had ever published in any known academic journal. Greaves knew what this meant. Reginald hadn't just lied. He'd built a false intellectual framework, one that sounded real enough to avoid scrutiny. Next, he went after public records. The family had moved to Garreton in '96, but there was no documented purchase of the estate. No deed transfer, no tax record prior to 2000. The estate was listed as unclaimed heritage property. Yet somehow, Reginald had secured occupancy, utilities, and exemption status. When Greaves asked about it at the county clerk's office, the woman behind the desk went pale. That file's been moved. Sheriff's orders, I think. She refused to elaborate. Greaves spoke to Angela Dorset, and what she told him chilled him more than any document could. She described the hospital visit, Elias's words, the strange documents, the blue flame, the missing camera, the silence from her supervisors. She told Greaves she believed Clara was still in the house, that Elias had likely been hidden or cleansed somehow, and that the town had willfully constructed a wall around the family's strangeness to keep its own identity intact. Angela agreed to help Greaves, off the record. She gave him her case notes, unofficial ones, the ones she didn't file. They contained transcripts of conversations with Clara and Lawrence held in the hallway of the co-op during routine checks. Clara: "Father says we're vessels now. You can't break what's empty." Lawrence: "Fire speaks. It hurts, but it tells the truth." Greaves began compiling everything: journals, public statements, symbolic drawings, local interviews. A pattern began to emerge, not just of abuse, but of doctrine. He believed the Whitlocks were recreating an ancient mythos, one drawn from apocryphal texts and obscure mystic traditions. The name Aurelian Morsk appeared again and again, possibly an invented prophet figure, or Reginald's alter ego. He started writing. His working title: The Doctrine of the Flame, Ritual Control in Garreton. But before he could publish, he needed evidence, concrete, physical proof. So he did the unthinkable. On the night of April 9th, 2003, Martin Greaves trespassed onto the Whitlock estate. He brought a voice recorder, a flashlight, a press badge tucked in his coat, and what he found inside that house would change everything. It wasn't just a house, it was a stage. Every object meant something, every wall had a voice, and the deeper I went, the more I realized they'd built a theology from scratch. Martin Greaves, interview transcript, May 2003, April 9th, 2003. A cold night, clear skies. The town of Gerritton was still. Martin Greaves parked half a mile down the road and walked the rest on foot, sticking to the tree line behind the Whitlock estate. The manor was dark, save for one flickering orange light in the attic. No motion detectors, no dogs. The perimeter was quiet, too quiet. It felt like walking into something that already knew I was coming. Greaves. Field notes. He entered through a broken window in the cellar. One he suspects was left open intentionally. A trap, perhaps, or a warning ignored. The smell hit him first. Wax, copper, mildew, and something acrid, like scorched herbs. The basement was lined with bookshelves, floor to ceiling, not with novels, but with identical leather-bound volumes, all hand-labeled. Obedience, Cleansing Rites, Spring, Songs for the Fire. Every book, handwritten, same ink, same binding, dozens, hundreds of pages of theology. Original theology, symbols that looked half runic, half scholarly, rituals with steps, chants, incantations. He took photos, he turned on his recorder, and then he found the first journal, labeled Clara, Year 12. The entries were brief, often incomplete, but deeply disturbing. March 7th. Father says I'm still too full. Fire tonight. I must offer more. March 19th. Lawrence held my arms while Mother painted the sigil. I bit my tongue to keep the noise in. March 22nd. He said Elias is too soft. That fire won't take to him unless he learns to see ash as mercy. Each entry was signed, not with a name, but with a symbol, a burning eye above a triangle. That same image would later be found etched beneath the wallpaper in the children's bedroom. Greaves climbed to the main floor. The house was immaculately organized, not abandoned but arranged. There were no photos, no clutter, just rows of relics, wax figurines, some melted, some intact, in the shape of children kneeling. Candles placed in odd-numbered clusters, 3, 5, 7. Mirrors turned inward, facing walls. One room, painted entirely black, held nothing but a wooden chair and a drain in the center of the floor. Burn marks formed a ring around the chair. Later, forensic specialists would identify trace amounts of dried blood and animal tissue inside the drain, but that night Greaves just took photos, quietly, heart pounding, and then, from the second floor, he heard something. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. He froze. Footsteps, and chanting. A woman's voice, soft but rhythmic. Latin, no, something older, twisted vowels, repeated syllables. Greaves crept to the base of the stairs and peeked upward. He saw Margaret Whitlock in a white shift, her eyes closed, standing in front of a burning altar of bone and wax. Behind her was Clara, eyes open, watching, but not at Margaret, watching him. She didn't scream, she didn't move, she just smiled. Greaves backed away, quiet, careful. He exited through the same cellar window. He didn't stop walking until he reached his car. He drove through the night, recorder in hand, photos secured in his glove box. 2 days later, he submitted everything to the Washington State Patrol and FBI field office in Seattle. The reaction was immediate. Forensic teams were dispatched. The Whitlock property was placed under surveillance, but when they finally moved in, the house was empty. No Whitlocks, no bodies, no children. But what they found inside confirmed Greaves' worst fears. The main floor had been cleared, furniture removed, wax figures smashed, ashes scattered in the fireplace, but the basement remained untouched. Dozens of volumes of ritual doctrine, journals signed in childlike handwriting, and a small, locked chest. Inside, several human baby teeth, a bundle of hair tied with red twine, a photograph, old, faded. A family that wasn't the Whitlocks, standing in front of the same house, dated 1929. That family, records would later reveal, vanished in 1930. No trace ever found. it became clear the Whitlocks didn't just create a theology. They created a performance, a web of false names, fabricated identities, and meticulously orchestrated doctrine. No birth certificates, no school records. Even their religious organization, the Order of the Flame Beneath, had been registered under shell corporations tied to P.O. boxes across 4 states. Nothing was real, except the suffering. They didn't think they were evil. That's the worst part. They thought they were purifying the world, that they'd been chosen to separate the ash from the flesh. Dr. Carol Hensley, forensic psychologist, Behavioral Cultic Studies Unit. To understand the Whitlock family, we have to understand their doctrine, the doctrine of the flame beneath. It wasn't a borrowed system, not holy. Greaves's research and FBI analysis concluded that Reginald Whitlock had created an entirely original belief structure, stitched from fragments of medieval mysticism, esoteric Christianity, and fabricated myth. A cultic theology without a god, only a fire. They didn't worship a deity, they worshipped purification. At the center of their belief was an entity they called the flame beneath flesh, not a being, a process, a sacred cleansing force. According to the texts found in the basement, all humans are born impure, bloated with flesh sin, a term repeated more than 200 times across different volumes. Only through ritual pain, obedience, and cleansing by fire could one become vessel. Children, being unformed, were the most malleable clay. They could be emptied of corruption and remade. The doctrine divided people into 2 categories. Kindling, those too tainted to be saved. They must be consumed. Vessels, those who could be hollowed out and filled with obedience. To become a vessel is to lose self, name, thought, to be nothing but channel, no joy, no shame, only lightless fire. Excerpt from Manual of Sacred Hollowing, Volume 3. Margaret's journal entries, found hidden beneath floorboards in the cellar, gave chilling context. Clara weeps less now. Her voice cracks, but her eyes no longer resist. She is almost hollow. I will soon present her to the eye. Elias bleeds wrong, too soft, too bright. Reginald says he must be corrected, or offered. There were also pages dedicated to punishment rituals, periods of silent darkness, days without food, tongue binding to silence corruption, and the burning chair used to cauterize disobedience. The fireplace was sacred. Fire was both weapon and sacrament. Investigators also uncovered multiple symbols used throughout the house. A burning eye atop a triangle, thought to represent the all-seeing purifying force. A 7-tongued flame, found painted in blood near the attic altar, and most chilling, a circle of ash within a ring of teeth used to mark spaces where kindling were consumed. Authorities now believe this symbol was used in cleansing ceremonies, possibly to justify murder as a sacred act. And in Clara's final journal, one line is written again and again. The flesh will lie. The ash tells truth. The fire remembers. Dr. Carol Hensley, one of the leading forensic psychologists on the case, described the theology as a closed circuit. It teaches that anything outside the belief system is impure, so questioning it becomes a sin. That's classic cult logic. But what's unique is how it turns suffering into sanctity. It doesn't want followers. It wants tools, empty vessels. Clara was 18 by the time the house was raided. She had likely spent 10 years being hollowed out. Lawrence, the eldest, had probably assisted in rituals, learning to perform sacred punishments by age 14. And Elias, there is still no official record of his fate, but in one recovered passage from a volume titled The Ash Litany, there's a deeply disturbing line: "If the vessel fails, return it to flame. Let the cinders be buried beneath the prayer root. Speak no name." No grave has been found, but dozens of small pits, filled with bone fragments, were excavated behind the estate. DNA tests have been inconclusive. What makes the Whitlock theology so terrifying is not just its cruelty, but its deliberate construction. Reginald didn't stumble into madness. He architected it. He created a religion tailored to control, pain, and obedience. He used love as a lever, guilt as a forge, and fire, always fire, as proof of purity. It was more than a belief system. It was a blueprint for obliteration. We didn't go in expecting what we found. We thought it was a weird family playing at religion. What we found was, it was a machine, a house built to hurt. Special Agent Roland K., FBI Tactical Response Unit. Debrief notes, April 2003, April 15, 2003, 4:13 a.m. Under the shroud of early morning fog, federal agents, local deputies, and child welfare officers executed a coordinated raid on the Whitlock estate. They had thermal imaging, entry teams, and 2 mobile forensic units waiting down the road. There was no movement inside the house, no light, no sound. The tactical team breached through the front and rear simultaneously, and what they walked into has been described in internal reports as one of the most disturbing domestic crime scenes in Washington state history. The first floor was mostly empty, stripped bare, except for a large table in the dining room. On it, 7 burned-down black candles, a child's shoe, and what appeared to be dried strips of skin arranged in a spiral. No people, just remnants. In the living room, agents found a series of painted words etched directly into the wood beneath the rug. They had to use UV lights to see it clearly. It read, "The flame takes what resists. The ash remembers what obeys." Then came the basement. Inside the cellar, agents found a narrow pit, 6 feet deep, lined with animal bones and human remains, partially burned. 6 mannequins, dressed in the Whitlock children's clothes, arranged in a kneeling circle. A large, leather-bound book on a pedestal titled The Final Offering, a litany of obedience. But the house was not abandoned. They found Clara. She was discovered behind a hidden door, sealed into a false wall, sitting in what authorities referred to as the vessel chamber. Naked except for ritual markings drawn in ash and what appeared to be her own blood, she was seated in a meditative pose, eyes open, unblinking, body motionless. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She just said one phrase, repeatedly, "The fire will return. The vessel must wait." She was 18, severely underweight, multiple healed fractures, scarification along her back and scalp, and, perhaps most hauntingly, she had no visible reaction to human contact. She had been conditioned not to respond. Lawrence was found in the attic. He had hung himself just hours before the raid. The room was bare, except for a burned circle around his body and a note, written in a mixture of Latin, English, and what appeared to be the constructed language from Reginald's doctrine. One line stood out, translated by FBI linguists. "I am clean now. The fire need not chase me." Reginald and Margaret were gone, but the search revealed they had been preparing their exit for weeks. Investigators uncovered a tunnel system beneath the estate, crude but functional, leading nearly half a mile through the woods to a disguised maintenance shed. Inside were sleeping bags, canned food, passports, and over $37,000 in cash. The passports were forged, the names were different, but the photos, them. The FBI believes they escaped days before the raid, possibly tipped off or simply aware enough of Greaves' investigation to anticipate the timeline. Interpol notices were issued. They've never been found. The final and most devastating discovery came 1 week later. A forensic team, re-examining the backyard, noticed a pattern of depressions in the earth that didn't match the original landscaping. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed multiple burial sites, at least 11. In each one, small bones, teeth, and remnants of ritual markings drawn on slats of wood. The bodies were too degraded for full identification. But one set of remains, a child between 9 and 11 years old, showing signs of healed leg fractures and a malformed foot, matched Elias Whitlock's medical record from his brief hospital stay. The coroner's report concluded he died from blunt force trauma, sustained likely before being burned. He had not been offered. He had been discarded. Clara was institutionalized under protective custody. For nearly a year, she did not speak beyond ritual phrases, but in 2004, she began to answer questions. Not as Clara, but as a voice she called the vessel. "Reginald made us pure. We carried the sin of the town. The fire took what was too full. We were the hollow. We were the saved." The town of Gerriton had to face a truth it had long refused to see. The Whitlocks were not a curiosity, not an eccentric family. They were a cult built in plain sight, and their rituals had stolen more than lives. They had stolen trust. You think justice will give you peace, but sometimes all it gives you is paperwork and nightmares. Angela Dorset, former CPS investigator, 2006 interview. The aftermath of the Whitlock case was swift and slow, public and painfully incomplete, because while the raid made national headlines and Clara's survival was declared a miracle, the absence of Reginald and Margaret Whitlock, the architects of it all, left the story without its ending. They were never found. Despite Interpol red notices, sightings in Quebec, and a grainy surveillance photo from a Lisbon port in 2004, the trail went cold. They became ghosts, just like the belief system they created, lingering, whispering, infecting the edges of those who survived. Clara Whitlock was placed in a long-term psychiatric facility outside Olympia under the pseudonym Jane W3. For nearly 3 years, she remained nonverbal, alternating between catatonia and ritual repetition. Then in 2006, she began to speak as herself again. A court-appointed psychologist, Dr. Naomi Feld, described the process as a spiritual exorcism through therapy. Clara had to unlearn her identity. She remembered little about her mother's affection, but spoke at length about the rituals, how disobedience meant hours of kneeling on rice, how siblings were forced to cleanse each other with scalding water, how Lawrence once broke his hand during a punishment and was praised for offering bone to the flame. When asked about Elias, she wept quietly, then whispered, "He didn't burn right. He cried too much. They said it made him wrong." Despite her trauma, Clara testified via deposition in the State versus Whitlock proceedings in 2007. Her statements helped solidify the basis for a new category of abuse in Washington law, ritual-based domestic control. But because the primary defendants were missing, no trial ever took place. Instead, the state pursued charges against 3 peripheral members of the Order of the Flame Beneath, discovered through banking records and recovered letters. One was a notary who certified forged documents. Another was a reclusive herbalist who supplied tinctures later tested for psychoactive compounds. The third was a former seminarian, Matthew Verdin, who helped transcribe Reginald's doctrine in the mid-90s. Only Verdin received prison time, 11 years for conspiracy and endangering the welfare of minors. He served 6. Angela Dorset, the CPS investigator who first flagged the case, resigned in 2005. In her resignation letter, she wrote, "The system didn't fail the Whitlock children. It refused to even try, and I can't be a part of that anymore." She later published a memoir titled Ash Beneath Our Feet. Proceeds went to a victim relief fund for ritual abuse survivors. Martin Greaves, whose investigation broke the case wide open, received several awards, but paid a price. In 2004, his home was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but a circle of ash and a burned doll were left on his kitchen table. No fingerprints, no arrests. He moved to Chicago the following year and now lectures on domestic cultic architecture and coercive theology. When I spoke to him in 2021, he said, "I still have dreams about that house. Not nightmares, just echoes, rooms that remember me." But the trauma extended beyond the survivors. Gerriton, Washington, the town that looked away, had to confront its reflection. For years, people avoided the topic. Children were warned not to speak the name Whitlock, but silence rotted the roots. So in 2011, a group of residents organized a public event, the Vigil of Ash, a candlelit walk through the woods near the estate's ruins. At the center of the walk, a plaque was placed, "For the children who were emptied, may we never be blind again." But trauma doesn't end with justice, not when the fire escaped the hearth and took pieces of an entire town with it. The thing about evil is, it doesn't arrive with horns. It comes wearing Sunday clothes, with a polite nod, and asks if you'd like to try the tea. Daniel Harrow, Field Notes, 2023. It's been over 20 years since the Whitlocks walked into Gerriton, and in many ways they never left. The estate itself was demolished in 2008, not for safety reasons, but because no one would buy the land. Developers wouldn't touch it. The town council voted unanimously to raise it to the foundation. Some said they heard cracks from the chimney, even as the bulldozers pulled it down, like a body resisting exhumation. What remains now is a clearing. Grass doesn't grow quite right there. The shadows in the trees fall a little too straight. A memorial stone sits at the center of that clearing. To the ones who were made hollow, may your names be returned to you. But there are no names listed, because we still don't know how many victims there truly were. We know about Elias. We suspect more. Bones were found, teeth, symbols, but no records. The Whitlocks didn't keep track of who they destroyed, only how. In 2014, Washington state passed the Clara Whitlock Act, establishing mandatory reporting for any suspected ritualistic or spiritual abuse of minors, regardless of religious exemption status. It also introduced training for social workers and first responders on coercive control indicators, such as isolation through purity doctrines, symbolic punishment, and spiritualized starvation. Clara herself, now living under a new name in an undisclosed location, spoke anonymously to a journalist in 2018. In that interview, she said, "I don't know who I am without the fire, but I know I'm not the vessel anymore. I feel the weight of my name coming back to me, letter by letter." DT. She now volunteers for an organization that assists survivors of spiritual abuse. As for Reginald and Margaret Whitlock, the architects of the doctrine of the flame beneath, their faces remain on interagency wanted lists to this day. Interpol believes they are dead. Some agents believe they took their own lives in the woods of Eastern Europe, trying to return to the flame. Others believe they're still alive, still teaching, still looking for vessels. The cult may have died in Gerriton, but belief systems don't end in smoke. They move, they adapt, and they wait. I visited Gerriton last year, stopped by the library where Lawrence once stood too still, walked past the school where Elias whispered into the grass, stood in the field where the house once was. A child passed by me, holding her mother's hand. The mother smiled, nodded, and said, "You must be the man from the podcast. Please tell them we remember. Please tell them we're sorry." I promised her I would. So, here it is. The truth. As much of it as we could find. A record, a macabre record, because sometimes monsters wear polished shoes and smile at town meetings, and sometimes they call themselves Father. Thank you for listening. I'm Daniel Harrow, and this has been a Macabre Record.